Hello and welcome to the West Chronicle, and today we'll be looking at Weimar and Nazi Germany 1919. It'll be a detailed analysis looking at one particular year. Right, so before we start, if you can just get yourself some scrap paper and a pen, jot down any events you do know and any key dates you know as well. It'll help you because that way you can figure out what knowledge you do and don't have. And without further ado, let's get cracking. So this video is going to focus on Germany in 1919. However, just before we move on to the events of 1919, it's important to recap on what we know so far. We know the war ended in 1918. We also know that in 1918, the Kaiser decides to abdicate, or he's forced to. We have the Declaration of the Republic by Philip Scheidemann, and we also have the Council of People's Representative, and finally, the signing of the armistice. However, what I forgot to mention was the legacy of the First World War. See, the First World War lasted for 4 years. During that time, there was a blockade by Britain at the end of the war, which led to 750,000 people who were German who died just from starvation due to that blockade. You also had 11 million people that were German fighting in that war, and out of that 11 million, almost 2 million died and 4 million were injured. Now, if you put that into context, you'd have around about 55% of German troops that became casualties. That's a lot of people. So after the setting up of the Weimar Republic and the armistice being signed, there was a 9-month period where Ebert and the Weimar Republic decided that it'd be a good idea to make sure everything is in order. Ebert started this off by speaking to the civil servants. He made sure the civil servants understood that no matter what happens, even though the Kaiser has abdicated, they would keep the jobs. Not only would they keep the jobs, they would make sure that they collect taxes, they run schools, and all the things that need a country to run would still be in place. It was a master stroke by Ebert because it meant that, one, the most important cog that keeps the whole country running was in place and on side. Having secured the support of the civil servants, Ebert realized he needed the support of the army, and he made sure to do this by informing General Groener, the same General Groener who made the Kaiser abdicate, that the officers would keep their ranks as long as the German army listened to what the Weimar Republic said. Also, Ebert encouraged the industry leaders such as Hugo Steins that the new republic won't take land off them. And finally, he got trade unions on side. For example, Karl Liebknecht, if that's how you pronounce his name, I'm not sure if that is how it's pronounced, but he tells the leader of the trade unions that there'd be an 8-hour working day. After the abdication of the Kaiser, the Council of People's Representatives was formed, and the idea was that it was temporary and he'll just look after Germany until an actual government could be set up with a new constitution in place. So elections took place in January 1919, and the elections were a huge success. 82% of the electorate turned out to vote. That means people who are eligible to vote. So not little kids running around going, yeah, I want to vote. It was actual people of age who could vote that came out to vote, and 82% is a huge margin. That means that majority of the population that could vote voted. When you take into account that today around about 40 to 50% of people turn out to vote, that was a massive amount. On top of that, the moderate parties gained huge amounts. For example, the SPD gained 40% of the vote, whereas the Centre Party gained 20%. A lot of people always wonder, why is the Weimar Republic called the Weimar Republic? And it's quite obvious really. You see, there was a lot of strikes and unrest in Berlin at the time. So when the new assembly met up in February of 1919, they decided it's probably not a great idea to meet up in Berlin, probably get shot. So they thought it was a better idea to turn up at a little town called Weimar, and that is where the first meeting took place. Believe it or not, it was about 250 kilometers away, and during that meeting it took about 6 months for them to reach an agreement on what the constitution should look like. So on July 31st, 1919, the National Assembly agreed to a new constitution, a set of rules on how the Weimar Republic should look. The Weimar Constitution, I'll give it my best shot to explain it to you. It had a system, so the electorate are the people who can vote. It's anyone over the age of 21. They elected a head of state, or in this case, a president. The president was in charge of the Weimar Republic. He was elected every 7 years, and he really didn't get involved in day-to-day life in Germany at all. He did have some powers. For example, he got to choose the chancellor. And he also had the power to invoke this article called Article 48, which meant that he could dissolve the parliament and take complete control. Could become a dictator if he wanted to. So the person that's selected by the public is someone they trust. Another part of the constitution was the parliament. Again, this was elected by the people or the electorate. The parliament was made up of two houses, a bit like the House of Commons and the House of Lords. You had the Reichstag, which was the most important one, and the Reichsrat. You pass any law that you want to go through Germany through these two houses, and if you want it to become law, it has to make sure that it's agreed by these houses. The Reichstag was more powerful. It controlled things like taxes. It actually was elected by the people every 4 years. On the other hand, the Reichsrat, which was also elected every 4 years, it was representing specific regions of Germany. So it wasn't the whole of Germany, it was just parts of it. Each region in Germany would send certain representatives. So the bigger the region, the more representatives they send. The smaller the region, obviously less representatives for them. The final part of the constitution was the government. Both the president and the parliament elected the government. So the president chose the chancellor and the parliament chose the cabinet. The chancellor was the head of government. He chose all the ministers that would work with him within that government. And the cabinet was the most important ministers, and they worked alongside the chancellor, and they made most of the important decisions within the cabinet. The setting up of the constitution was a massive success. Some of the strengths of the constitution lay in the fact that it was the first democracy ever in Germany. On top of that, women finally were able to get the vote. This is actually before Britain. On top of that, the voting age had been reduced from the age of 25 all the way to the age of 21. Believe it or not, Germany was actually more of a democracy than Britain at this time. Secondly, you had proportional representation. Now, you might be wondering what proportional representation is. It literally means that if you got a certain amount of votes, in this case 60,000, you would get one seat in the Reichstag. It meant that smaller parties actually got heard, and on a whole, people actually enjoyed the idea of everyone getting a say, like a true democracy. However, this did have its flaws. Another strength of the constitution was the fact that it was quite balanced. The president, who was elected by the people, had a vast amount of power. For example, he chose the chancellor. Not only that, he could get rid of the Reichstag, he could call new elections, and he could assume control of the army. See, he was elected every 7 years, so you could change the president every 7 years if you wanted. Well, generally you would. Secondly, you had the chancellor. The chancellor would pass laws, but only if the Reichstag and the Reichsrat, the two houses in the parliament, agreed with it. Even the houses within the parliament, the Reichstag, when they passed the law, the Reichsrat had to agree to it. If the Reichsrat said, no, I don't agree with this law, they would have to get 2/3 of a majority in the Reichstag house to pass that law. And finally, individual Reichsrat areas, such as Prussia and Bavaria, could still control their own key services, such as the police, courts and schools. This meant that everyone felt happy. Up until now, it sounds like the Weimar Constitution is amazing. However, there were massive flaws in it. One such flaw was proportional representation. I know I told you that it was really good. However, there's a negative side to it. For example, the fact that everyone got a say and the smaller parties got a vote meant that no one party could claim a majority. Eventually, coalitions that were put together to try and get a majority would argue with each other and they'd fall apart. So, if you take into account between 1919 and 1923, there were 9 coalition governments that tried to get a majority. That just shows you how unstable the Weimar Constitution was. A further weakness of the Constitution was the idea that it was based on division. For example, when proportional representation gave everyone a say, it meant that extremist parties like the nationalists and the communists would actually get their voices heard. And they openly opposed the idea of having a electorate and the idea that everyone should have a democratic say. So for them to get a platform meant they actually opposed the very foundation of the constitution. Additionally, you can also point out to the fact that a lot of people still miss the Kaiser and wish that Germany was still a monarchy. I've saved the most obvious weakness for last, and that happens to be the weakness that eventually ends the Weimar Republic, which I'll get onto later, and that is Article 48. Article 48 of the Constitution meant that the Chancellor could ask the President to take power and pass any law he wanted without consulting the Reichstag. The problem with that is it meant that there's no longer a democracy. Now you might be wondering, hold up, that makes sense. If there's a crisis, you need someone in charge. But what it meant was that the Weimar Republic looked weak. For example, the president would pass a law rather than speak to the Reichstag, and by doing that, it shows that democratic systems do not work. Moreover, some people even thought that if the president was gonna enact Article 48, it was the same thing as the Kaiser anyway, so why not just have one overruling person rather than having this democracy where one person always kept the power using Article 48. As I mentioned earlier, on the 11th of November 1918, Matthais Erzberger decided that he, along with other representatives, would sign the armistice ending the war. However, the punishment for the war had not been dealt with yet, and that took place on the 28th of June 1919. It took place in the form of the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed at Versailles Palace in the Hall of Mirrors. So what was the Treaty of Versailles, to be exact? The simplest way to remember the Treaty of Versailles is lamb. That's right, lamb, as in baby sheep. The first year of a sheep's life, it's called a lamb. And you might be wondering, what's that got to do with the treaty? Lamb is short for land, army, money and blame. Those are the four main factors of the Treaty of Versailles, and if you remember it like that, it's pretty simple to regurgitate in an exam or if you're explaining the treaty to anyone. Before I go into the treaty, I want to just explain the context to it a little so you understand what happened. When the Treaty of Versailles was formally ratified, it consisted of three countries. So there was Britain, France and America. You had Lloyd George from Britain, you had Clemenceau from France, and you had Woodrow Wilson from America. These three people all decided what would happen to Germany. Germany itself was not represented. This left a bitter taste for Germany as they felt their grievances were never heard. So let's look at the treaty itself. Let's start with the first part of lamb, which is land. Alsace and Lorraine was lost to France. As you know, Alsace and Lorraine was gained through the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871. This was a massive slap in the face for Germany. Eupen and Malmedy was also lost to Belgium. You also had Posen in West Prussia, which was lost to Poland. That was a massive problem because a lot of German citizens and German-speaking people lived there, which meant that Germany was essentially split into two. You also had plebiscites, and during those plebiscites they decided whether to stay with Germany, whether they become part of the League of Nations, which is like the police force of the world, or they go to the other country. Upper Silesia decided to become part of Poland, Northern Schleswig decided to become part of Denmark, and Danzig was made into an international city. As you know, that meant that Germany's ports were no longer secure. The biggest loss of territory was the Saar coalfields. See, Germany had to give the output, what they made from the Saar coalfields, over to France. This was a massive problem because coal, not only was it rare, it was extremely valuable, and that meant that economically Germany had been stunted. Finally, we have the Rhineland. The Rhineland was an area between France and Germany. This became demilitarized. That meant that Germany could no longer bring any troops in that area. If they did, they would be sanctioned by the League of Nations. So overall, territorially, Germany was decimated. It lost 13% of its European territories and 10% of its German-speaking population. Bear that in mind, German-speaking people had been sent to other countries. When plebiscites later happened, they decided to come back, and the evil spawn of Satan, Adolf Hitler, decides to use that to start a war, which you learn about later. All of its colonial territories were taken off them, and any investments they had made were also taken from them. 50% of its iron and 15% of its coal reserves were stripped off them, just because these territories were taken. So let's move on to the second part of the Treaty of Versailles, or in this case, the second part of lamb, the army. The army was reduced to 100,000 men. They weren't allowed any more than that, and this was the army that would protect their borders from any foreign invaders. On top of that, Germany were no longer allowed any heavy artillery that had been useful in the war and decimated much of the Allied territory. However, they could have artillery within their borders. The naval side of things was largely dictated by Britain. See, Britain decided that it would be a good idea to reduce the navy of Germany. And the reason they did this was the naval race. Between 1906 and 1911, Britain and Germany were engaged in a naval race. Britain had built a boat called the Dreadnought. The Dreadnought was called the 5 Minuten. Within 5 minutes it could destroy any ship in the water. Germany decides to copy that and make their own version of the Dreadnought. This causes a naval race, with both sides building ships as fast as they can. Eventually, by 1911, Britain wins that race, but not without thinking that Germany are hot on its heels, and also a massive threat to Britain's naval superiority. So when the time comes to punish Germany, they are the first ones to make sure the navy is greatly reduced. So what actually happened to the navy? Germany was told to reduce its navy to 6 battleships and cruisers, 12 destroyers and torpedo boats, and not a single submarine was allowed. See, submarines were one of the biggest problems during the First World War, so they made sure they were no longer there. The rest of the fleet was to be destroyed. So on to the third part of the Treaty of Versailles, or the third part of LAM, which is money. Now, money is quite simple. All you need to remember is that the reparations, which are the actual cost of the damages that Germany was blamed for during the war, were to be repaid, and the amount that was eventually fixed was 136 billion marks, or in English money it's 6.6 billion. 6.6 is a simple way to remember it. 6.6 billion pound was a humongous amount of money. It pretty much crippled the German economy, and it allowed the extremist parties to blame the Weimar Republic for accepting such a huge amount. Remember the November criminals. So the last part of LAM was how Germany was blamed for the First World War. Now, it came in 3 parts. You had the war guilt clause, you had the Dolchstoss, and you had the Diktat. I'll go through each one individually. So the Treaty of Versailles was split into articles, and there's one article in particular that the Germans hated. It was Article 231, and it stated that Germany had caused the war and also was to blame for the war. Germany obviously did not agree. The war guilt clause meant that because Germany was blamed for the war, it had to pay for the war. And that was a massive sticking point with a lot of Germans. The second part of blame lies in the idea of the Diktat. The Diktat is this idea that the Germans felt that the Treaty of Versailles was a dictated peace. They didn't actually get a say in it. They felt that the people that were in charge, in this case Britain, France and America, had decided what was going to happen to them without listening to any of the grievances. They felt super hard done by. Not only that, they called the Treaty of Versailles a diktat, and they thought that really they should make some concessions, so allow the Germans to have some leeway, because when you think about it logically, it was the Kaiser that caused the war, not the German people. So why are the German people getting punished for the Kaiser's mistake when he's off in Holland living a happy life? The final part of blame lay with Dolchstoss. The Dolchstoss was this idea that Germany was stabbed in the back. Now, when matthais Erzberger and the representatives went and signed the armistice, they agreed to end the war. However, a lot of Germans, as I mentioned before, were not happy with this idea because they did not feel they were losing. They just thought they were retreating. So, as a result of that, a lot of Germans felt that those politicians had stabbed the German army in the back. Hence, the stab in the back theory, the Dolchstoss. It could be argued that this was the most dangerous of the 3 aspects of the blame, because this meant that extreme right-wing nationalists and left-wing communists could use the argument that the army had been stabbed in the back and the people had been stabbed in the back, hence why we don't want the Treaty of Versailles and we want to reverse it. Erzberger and those who signed the armistice came to be known as the November criminals. This was a name that Hitler used later on to discredit the Weimar Republic, stating that they were untrustworthy and they were humiliating the German people. As I mentioned previously, the moderate parties controlled the government. 80% of the seats in the assembly were controlled by the Social Democrats, the Democrats and the Centre Party. However, there were small groups of extreme left and right-wing parties. Now the question is, who were these left and right-wing parties? On the far right, we have the DNVP, the National Party, who were the biggest right-wing party in 1919. But you also had the NSDAP, who were the extreme right. We all know them as the Nazi party. So what did the right wing actually want? The right wing wanted a strong army. They wanted the Kaiser back in power. They supported capitalism. They wanted private ownership of land. And they championed the idea of family, law and order, business, and traditional values. Most important of all, they put the rights of the nation before any individual, the idea of nationalism. On the other end of the spectrum were the extreme left. The KPD, or the German Communist Party, were the biggest party in 1919. The idea of the extreme left was simple. They wanted to oppose capitalism. They did not believe in privatizing. They did not want to own land. They thought that you get all the land and you share it out between the workers equally. That means there will be no big businesses. The extreme left was a massive threat to big businesses who felt that their land would be taken off them. So let's look at a specific challenge from the left. Of course, I'm talking about the Spartacist Uprising, a revolt that took place in 1919. The revolt was backed by the German Communist Party, the KPD, which was set up in December 1918. Now, the German Communist Party had a massive membership. It had about 400,000 members, and it had about 33 newspapers that were publishing daily. So the support for the communists was massive. You might be wondering where the Spartacists got their name from. Spartacists actually got their name from a Roman gladiator by the name of Spartacus, who decided that he had enough of Rome and was going to overthrow them. He led a rebellion, raised an army, and actually marched on Rome. Eventually he was found and killed, and the rebellion was defeated. The leaders of this left-wing rebellion were two individuals known as Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. So what actually caused the Spartacist Uprising? It was actually the sacking of a police chief named Emil Eichhorn. Emil Eichhorn was a left-wing socialist, and he actually was liked by a lot of the workers. When Ebert decided to remove him from office as the police chief, the workers went on strike. The Spartacists saw this as an opportunity, and they called for a general strike. And on the 6th of January, over 100,000 workers took to the streets. They went about their way seizing communication, and by that I mean they seized the newspapers and the telegraph offices, and the Weimar government pretty much lost control. Ebert now had a dilemma, as the German armed forces, or the Reichswehr, were in no shape to put down this uprising. So Ebert decided there was thousands of soldiers that had just returned from the war, and they were still armed with their guns, so the best thing he could do is get the Reichswehr to put them into units, and he called these groups the Freikorps. It's estimated that the Freikorps numbered around about 250,000 by 1919 in March. So at the end, as the Spartacist revolt grew, Ebert set the Freikorps on the rioters. The workers had no chance, because obviously they're facing members of the armed forces. By the 13th of January, the rebels had pretty much been defeated, and by the 16th, Luxemburg and Liebknecht had both been arrested. However, instead of arresting the two individuals, the Freikorps decided to kill them both. Liebknecht was shot, Luxemburg was struck in the head with a rifle, and then shot in the head. What's even worse is they dumped her body in a canal. This infuriated Ebert, as he felt they should have been put on trial. It undermined the constitution of Weimar Republic. Hey, you made it to the end of the video. I hope it was helpful. I know it was a bit long, but I tried to get in as much detail as I could. If you do get a moment, please do look at the videos, and if you do get a chance, please do subscribe. It does help me massively. Thank you for your support.